It started on a Wednesday evening in October, the kind of evening where the sky goes amber too early and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and something ending. My daughter called from the parking lot of a grocery store, her voice thin and careful the way it gets when she's been rehearsing what to say. She told me that she and my son-in-law were losing the lease on their rental. The landlord had decided to sell. They had 60 days. I didn't ask questions right away. I made her a cup of tea in my mind, the way mothers do even over the phone, and I listened. She told me they'd looked at 3 other places and none of them worked. Too expensive, too far from her job at the school district, or too small for the 2 of them and the baby they were already quietly hoping for. She didn't ask me for anything. She never did. But I heard it in the pauses. My house on Clover Street had been sitting half empty for 2 years. After my husband Gerald passed, I rattled around in those rooms like a marble in a shoebox. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a yard with a dogwood tree Gerald had planted the year our daughter was born. I had already moved most of my daily life into the guest cottage behind the main house, a small 2-room space Gerald built for his mother before she passed. I slept there most nights anyway. It was easier than waking up in a bed that felt too wide. I told her they could have the house. Take the main house, I said. I'll stay in the cottage. It's right there on the property, I said. We'd be neighbors without being on top of each other. She cried a little, said she didn't want to put me out, said they'd pay rent. I told her family doesn't pay rent to family. Just take care of it. It was your home once too. My son-in-law, I want to be fair about this, was not someone I had ever fully read. He was handsome in that easy, forgettable way, good at conversations at dinner parties, the kind of man who remembered to refill your wine glass but forgot your birthday. My daughter adored him. She called him steady, and maybe he was, in his own way. He worked in logistics, something about supply chain management that I never entirely understood. He had firm handshakes and strong opinions about sports teams, and occasionally he hugged me in that stiff, back-patting way that always felt practiced. His name was Derek. They moved in on a cold Saturday in November. I helped them carry boxes. Derek carried the heavy ones and made a point of mentioning it. My daughter kept stopping to look around the rooms and smiling in this soft, disbelieving way that made all of it feel worth it. She found the window seat in the upstairs bedroom, where she used to curl up as a girl, and she pressed her hand flat against the cushion like she was taking a pulse. I showed them where the furnace filter was, how to reset the circuit breaker, which faucet ran cold before it ran hot. I told them the dogwood bloomed pale pink in April and that the neighborhood had a block party every 4th of July. Derek nodded through most of it. That particular nod, that means someone is waiting for you to finish. My daughter held my hand. The first few months were genuinely good. We had Sunday dinners. I would cook and bring things over, or she would knock on my cottage door and ask if I wanted to come in for coffee. Derek was civil, sometimes almost warm. He fixed the latch on my cottage gate without being asked, and I thought, maybe I had been unfair to him. Then spring came, and things shifted in ways that were easy to dismiss one at a time. My daughter mentioned that Derek wanted to take the small desk from the study, Gerald's desk, the one with the brass drawer pulls and the green leather top. He needed it for his home office. I said of course, thinking he meant to use it in the house. When I walked by the study window a few weeks later, the desk was gone. When I asked my daughter about it, she said Derek had sold it. He'd needed the space, she said. He didn't think you'd mind. She looked uncomfortable. I told her it was fine. It wasn't fine. A few weeks after that, I noticed the rose gold mirror from the hallway was missing. Then, Gerald's fishing rods from the basement rack. Each time I asked, there was an explanation that arrived in my daughter's voice but clearly came from somewhere else. Derek was reorganizing. Derek was decluttering. Derek felt the house needed to breathe. I started knocking before I came in, even though no one had asked me to. I'm not sure when I started thinking of it that way, as something requiring permission. It was my house. My name on the deed, my name on the property tax bill that arrived every January, but something about the way Derek moved through the rooms had begun to make me feel like a guest in my own story. Then, one Saturday morning in May, I came to the back door with a bag of seedlings I'd been nursing in the cottage. intending to plant them along the south fence the way Gerald and I used to. Derek answered the door in a pressed shirt, holding his phone, and behind him I could see two people I didn't recognize sitting at my kitchen table. A man with a rolling suitcase, and a woman photographing the ceiling with her phone. I asked who they were. Derek stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. He said they were guests, just for the weekend. He'd started listing a few weekends a month on one of those short-term rental apps, he said. The house was big, they weren't using all the rooms, and it was good extra income. He said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, like he was describing a sensible budget decision, not strangers sleeping in the bedroom where my daughter was born. I asked him if my daughter knew. She thinks it's a good idea, he said, smiling with only his mouth. I went back to the cottage, and I sat very still, for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it matters. It wasn't just anger. It was something older and quieter. It was the feeling of watching something you built, being handed to someone who didn't know its weight. Gerald had refinished those floors himself. I had painted the guest bedroom 3 times before we found the right shade of blue. Every corner of that house held something we had put there with intention. And now, strangers were photographing my ceilings and rolling suitcases down my hallways, and Derek was collecting money for it. I said nothing that week. I watched. I started paying closer attention. I found the listing online without much effort. 4-bedroom charming craftsman, it said. Fully updated, quiet neighborhood, perfect for families or groups. It had 63 reviews, an average of 4.8 stars. Guests called it cozy and welcoming, and said the host was responsive. Some mentioned the dogwood tree in the yard. 63 reviews. He had been doing this for months. I added up the approximate earnings based on the nightly rate he was charging. My hands were steadier than I expected when I did it. I set my phone down and looked out the cottage window at my house. At my house with its lights on and its driveway full and my son-in-law's car parked at an angle like he owned the place. Because he believed he did. That was the part I had to sit with. Derek had never been told otherwise. My daughter had told him her mother gave them the house to live in, and somewhere in the translation, or perhaps in the retelling Derek gave himself, it had become his house. Something he had inherited through marriage. Something he could monetize. I called my daughter the next morning and asked her to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, away from the house. She came to the diner on Maple with her hair in a ponytail and that open, eager expression she's had since she was 7, the one that trusts me before I've said a word. I told her what I'd found. I kept my voice even. I showed her the listing on my phone. She stared at it for a long time. She said she knew about the Airbnb in a general way, but not the scale of it. She hadn't known about 63 reviews. She hadn't known he'd been doing it since January. Her coffee went cold while she read through the listing description. When she put the phone down, she looked like someone doing math they didn't want to finish. He said it was just a few times, she said quietly. I covered her hand with mine. I'm not angry at you, I said. But you need to know that the house is still in my name. I never transferred the deed. I never intended to. And what Derek is doing, charging people to stay in a home he doesn't own, that's not something I can let continue. She nodded, but she didn't speak. I asked her to talk to him. I gave her 3 days. On the evening of the 3rd day, Derek came to the cottage door himself. He knocked twice, sharp and businesslike. When I opened the door, he was smiling, that same practiced smile from 100 dinners, but his eyes were doing something different. They were calculating. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said he hoped I wasn't upset about a little entrepreneurial initiative. He said the rental income was actually helping them save for their future, for a real home of their own someday. He said he was sure I could understand that. I asked him if he knew whose house he was renting out. He said he understood it was a family arrangement. I asked him to define that. He shifted his weight. He said he'd always assumed that eventually the house would pass to my daughter, that it was essentially already hers, and that he was simply being proactive about their financial future. I looked at him for a moment. He was still smiling. I told him I'd like him to shut down the listing, not pause it, shut it down. And I told him, no more bookings, no more guests, no more strangers in my house. His smile didn't change, but something behind it hardened. He said he had guests coming in 2 weekends from now, already paid, already confirmed. He said canceling would cost them money and hurt their review rating. I said I was sorry to hear that, and I closed my door. That night I found the number for my attorney, a woman named Pamela who had helped me set up Gerald's estate and had the kind of quiet authority that made you feel steadier just hearing her voice. I left a message. She called back the next morning. What followed was 2 weeks of the particular coldness that settles into a house when something unspoken is spreading through it like a draft. My daughter called me every day, sometimes to update me, sometimes just to hear my voice. She was trying to hold 2 things at once, loyalty to me and loyalty to her marriage, and the effort of it was visible in the shadows under her eyes. Derek stopped acknowledging me when we passed in the yard. He had incoming guests that Friday, 2 couples from out of state, and he clearly intended to proceed. I had Pamela send a formal letter to the address, hand-delivered by courier. It arrived Thursday afternoon. I was in my cottage when I heard the front door of the main house open and close hard. I heard Derek's voice, not the words, just the register, that flat, tight sound a man makes when he's been caught doing something he can't justify but isn't ready to admit. My daughter knocked on my door 20 minutes later. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said Derek was very upset. She said he felt blindsided. She said he wanted to know if I was seriously going to make this into a legal matter over a couple of rental weekends. I told her it wasn't about the weekends. I told her it was about the fact that my son-in-law had been building an income stream on property he didn't own and had never once thought to ask me about it. I told her that if I had tried to sell something of his, something he considered his, he would have had a great deal to say about it. She didn't argue. She went back inside. The guests arrived Friday evening anyway. A minivan, 2 couples, children's voices, a cooler being hauled up the porch steps. I watched from my cottage window. I waited until they were settled and the lights were on, and then I walked across the yard and I knocked on the front door. Derek opened it. He saw me, and the polite mask he'd been wearing for the guests flickered. I stepped inside. The living room had people in it I had never met. Children on the floor with a tablet, adults with wine glasses. They looked up at me with the curious, friendly expressions of people on vacation. I introduced myself. I said I was Dorothy, the owner of the property. I said I had some paperwork I needed to discuss with the host regarding the listing, and that I was sorry for any inconvenience. The room went very quiet. Derek said my name in a low, warning voice. One of the guest husbands stood up. He said they had paid for this reservation 3 weeks ago. He said he had a confirmation email. I told him I understood completely, and that none of this was his fault. I told him I had the property deed if anyone wanted to see it, and that I would be happy to work out a refund directly with them since the reservation had been made without my knowledge or consent. Derek told me to stop. His voice had lost the smile entirely now. I took the deed from the envelope I was carrying. The guest looked at the paper, then at Derek, then back at me. The wife with the wine glass set it down on the coffee table. "I'm the legal owner of record," I said. "I live in the cottage on this property. I did not authorize this rental." One of the guest wives pulled out her phone. I think she was looking up the app's policy on unauthorized listings. Her husband was already calculating something. The children had gone quiet in the way children do when adults are upset. Derek said very quietly that he wanted me to leave. I said I lived here. I said leaving was his option. He looked at my daughter, who had come downstairs and was standing at the bottom of the staircase with her arms wrapped around herself. He looked at her the way people look at someone they expect to save them. She looked back at him, and she didn't move. The guests left that night. I gave them the number for a hotel 2 miles away and told them I would personally arrange a full refund. The husband thanked me with a handshake that felt like an apology on Derek's behalf. After they left, the 3 of us sat in the kitchen. Derek had stopped talking. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw set, staring at the grain of the wood. My daughter made tea, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. I told him the listing needed to come down that night. I told him I had spoken with my attorney and that any future rentals would constitute unauthorized use of private property. I said this clearly, and without raising my voice. He asked why I hadn't just told him the house was still in my name. I asked why. He had never thought to ask. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat with it for a moment, and I watched something shift in his face. Not regret exactly, more like a man recalculating and finding the numbers don't work. I didn't like thinking I was taking advantage of a situation, he said finally. Whose situation? I asked. He looked up. The calculation left his eyes. What was underneath it was younger and more uncertain, something closer to genuine. He said he supposed he had told himself a version of events that made everything simpler, that the house was theirs to build a life in, truly theirs, and that if he could find a smart way to use it, that was just being resourceful. I said that was a story a lot of people tell themselves, that the difference between borrowing and owning is easy to blur when someone has been generous. That generosity doesn't transfer the deed. My daughter was very still across the table. Derek took down the listing that night. I watched the profile disappear on my phone. 63 reviews gone. Whether he felt the weight of that or just the embarrassment, I couldn't tell. But the house was quiet in a different way after that. Not the cold quiet of the weeks before, something more honest. The harder conversation came 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, when my daughter came to the cottage alone. She sat across from me with both hands around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and she said she didn't know how much of what Derek had done she had quietly enabled. She said she remembered me telling her the house was still in my name. She remembered that conversation clearly. But somewhere along the way, she had let Derek build his version of things without correcting him, because correcting him meant a fight she hadn't wanted to have. I told her I understood that more than she knew. I told her about all the small moments I had let pass. The missing mirror. The fishing rods. Every time I had decided it wasn't worth the friction. We are alike in that way, the two of us, and it is not always a virtue. She asked me if I was angry at her. I told her the truth. I told her I was sad for a while, and that sad is not the same as angry, though they can look similar from the outside. I told her that watching my home change shape around someone who didn't know its history had made me feel like I was disappearing, and that was the part that had taken me longest to name. She cried then, not loudly, just quietly at the table, and I let her. Derek and I did not have a warm reconciliation. I want to be honest about that too, because stories that wrap up too neatly are lying to you. We had a functional one. He apologized, and the apology was adequate, not eloquent, not emotional, just clear enough to be real. He said he had been building an image of himself as someone capable and self-made, and he had borrowed the scaffolding for it without examining where it came from. I appreciated the self-awareness more than the remorse, because self-awareness, at least, has a chance of sticking. What changed was slower and quieter than a single moment. My daughter started asking me more about the house, its history, the small markings of a life lived there. She asked about the scratches on the basement doorframe, where we had measured her height every birthday until she was 16. She asked about the window seat upstairs and whether it had always been there. I told her about the summer Gerald built it, how he measured wrong twice and drove to the lumberyard 3 times, and how she had sat in the sawdust and handed him tools at age 4, utterly serious about the whole operation. She laughed and cried at the same time. We found 2 of Gerald's missing books in a box in the basement. Derek had moved them there, not sold them, just moved them without understanding what they were. I brought them back to the cottage and set them on the shelf where they belonged. I had Pamela draw up a formal use agreement, not a rental arrangement, not a transfer of title, but a documented family agreement that made clear who owned what and what the terms of residence were. Derek signed it without objection. I thought he was relieved, actually, to have something explicit. The ambiguity had served him once and then it hadn't, and I think part of him understood that clarity was more sustainable than assumption. We still have Sunday dinners, though they look different now. My daughter does most of the cooking. I bring something from the garden and occasionally a pie. Derek asks about the dogwood, about the history of the neighborhood, questions he never thought to ask before. I answer them honestly. It is not the ease of people who have never hurt each other, But it is something I have come to think is better than that. It is the ease of people who have chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge, to stay at the table. One evening in late September, almost a year to the week from that first phone call in the grocery store parking lot, I was sitting on the cottage porch when my daughter came across the yard with a baby monitor in her hand. They were expecting their first child in 3 months. The dogwood had already turned, its leaves gone copper and rust, the way Gerald always said it looked best. She sat down beside me and we didn't speak for a while. The light was doing that amber thing it does in October, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something just beginning. She asked me if I was happy with how things had turned out. I thought about the desk that was gone, and the mirror that never came back, and the 63 reviews written by strangers about my home, and I thought about the window seat, and the measured door frame and the books back on the shelf. I told her I was. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to at age 9, watching television on the couch, that completely unself-conscious weight of a child who has no doubt they belong exactly where they are. I let her stay there until the light was gone and the porch went dark, and I didn't move once.